For as long as human beings have been making maps, they have been drawing a continent at the bottom of the world that they had never seen. The ancient Greeks, the same thinkers who calculated the Earth's circumference and argued for its spherical shape, reasoned that if there was a large landmass in the northern hemisphere, symmetry and balance required an equivalent landmass in the south. They called it Terra Australis Incognita, the unknown southern land. They drew it on their maps as a vast continent wrapping around the bottom of the world, connecting Africa to Asia, filling the Southern Ocean with the kind of temperate and populated land that the northern continents had provided. They put it on their maps with complete confidence and absolutely no evidence. For 2,000 years, the maps kept the continent. Cartographers drew it in different sizes and different shapes, sometimes enormous, wrapping around the entire Southern Ocean, sometimes more modest, a single large landmass at the pole, but the idea persisted with the specific tenacity of something that felt intuitively right even though no one had any evidence it was there. When Magellan sailed through the strait that bears his name in 1520 and looked south at the land visible on the southern side of the passage, the archipelago that is now called Tierra del Fuego, he thought he might be looking at the northern shore of the great southern continent. It wasn't. It was an island. The actual continent was still 2,000 kilometers further south, hidden behind the most violent ocean in the world. Cook came closest to finding it in the 18th century. James Cook, the greatest navigator of the age of sail, the farmer's son from Yorkshire who mapped the Pacific with a precision and a thoroughness that left almost nothing unmapped, crossed the Antarctic Circle 3 times in his second voyage of 1772 to 1775, pushing further south than any previous navigator had gone. He was stopped by the pack ice, the floating sea ice that surrounds the Antarctic continent in winter and extends far into the Southern Ocean, creating a barrier that the wooden ships of the 18th century could not penetrate without catastrophic risk. He never saw land. He wrote in his journal that any land that lay beyond the ice barrier would be a country condemned to everlasting frigidity, never to yield to the warmth of the sun, a country which if anyone should have the resolution and perseverance to push yet further than I have done, I should not envy him the fame of the discovery, but I make bold to say that the world will derive no benefit from it. He was wrong about the benefit. He was right about the difficulty. And he was almost right about the discovery. He came within perhaps 120 kilometers of the Antarctic coast without seeing it, turned back by the ice, leaving the last continent undiscovered for another generation. The discovery, when it finally came, was made not by a great national expedition mounted by one of the major European powers but in the specific chaotic, competitive, and barely documented circumstances of the Southern Ocean sealing industry in the early 19th century. The men who first saw Antarctica were not explorers in the grand romantic tradition. They were hunters. They were there because they were following fur seals and elephant seals to the most remote and inhospitable waters on Earth, motivated not by the hunger for geographical knowledge but by the commercial hunger for seal oil and fur that had already depleted the seal populations of every more accessible Southern Ocean island. And in the specific chaos of the competing claims that the sealing industry generated, the actual first sighting of the Antarctic continent, one of the most consequential geographical discoveries in human history, became and has remained one of the most contested questions in the entire history of exploration. 3 men have serious claims to the first sighting. An American sealer, a British naval officer, a Russian naval captain. Their sightings were all made within months of each other in the southern summer of 1820 to 1821. None of them knew what the others were doing. All 3 of them were in approximately the same place at approximately the same time, looking at the same coast from different angles and in different weather conditions, and the historical record of what each of them saw and when they saw it is sufficiently ambiguous that historians have been arguing about the priority ever since without reaching a consensus that all 3 national traditions will accept. The American claimant is Nathaniel Palmer, 21 years old in 1820, the captain of a small sealing sloop called the Hero, based out of Stonington, Connecticut. Palmer was part of a fleet of American sealers that had pushed south of the South Shetland Islands in search of new sealing grounds, and in November 1820 he sailed further south than the rest of the fleet and reported seeing land to the south, the coast that is now called the Antarctic Peninsula. He was 21 years old. He was hunting seals. He probably did not fully understand the geographical significance of what he was looking at. The British claimant is Edward Bransfield, a Royal Navy officer who had been sent south with a merchant captain named William Smith, who had discovered the South Shetland Islands the previous year. Bransfield conducted a formal survey of the South Shetlands in January 1820 and may have sighted the Antarctic Peninsula as early as January 30th, which would make his the first sighting chronologically, predating Palmer by approximately 10 months, if the identification of what he saw as the Antarctic mainland rather than an island is accepted. The historical debate about whether Bransfield saw the Antarctic continent or one of the islands off its coast has never been fully resolved. The Russian claimant is Fabian von Bellingshausen, a Baltic German officer in the Imperial Russian Navy who commanded a two-ship expedition sent south by Tsar Alexander I in 1819 with the specific mission of exploring the Antarctic seas and pushing as far south as possible. Bellingshausen was the most experienced and the most scientifically equipped of the three claimants. His expedition was a proper scientific and naval enterprise rather than a commercial sealing voyage, and his sighting of what he described as an ice shelf on January 27, 1820, 3 days before Bransfield's possible sighting and approximately 10 months before Palmer's, is now recognized by many historians as the first sighting of the Antarctic continent, though the specific question of whether what he saw was the continental ice shelf or sea ice is still debated. The priority debate, American, British, or Russian, is, in one sense, a distraction from the more important story. The more important story is what the Southern Ocean world was like in the early 1820s, and what the discovery of Antarctica meant for that world and for the subsequent human relationship with the last continent. The South Shetland Islands, the archipelago that lies approximately 100 kilometers north of the Antarctic Peninsula and that had been discovered by William Smith in 1819, triggered one of the most frantic and most destructive sealing rushes in maritime history. Within a single season, 1820 to 1821, approximately 50 sealing vessels descended on the South Shetlands from Britain and America, killing fur seals in such numbers that the population was effectively destroyed within 2 years. The specific dynamic of the sealing industry, the race to find new grounds, to kill as many animals as possible before competitors arrived, to exhaust the resource completely and then move on, was the economic engine that drove the initial human engagement with the Antarctic world, and it left a legacy of ecological destruction that preceded any scientific understanding of the continent by decades. In the middle of this commercial slaughter, exploration continued. The Antarctic Peninsula, the finger of land that extends northward from the Antarctic continent toward South America, the most accessible part of Antarctica and the part that was first sighted and first explored, was gradually mapped by the naval expeditions and the more adventurous sealers of the 1820s and 1830s. The interior of the continent, and the question of whether the land being observed from ships was a single continental landmass or a collection of islands, remained entirely unknown. The great national expeditions of the late 1830s and 1840s began the scientific investigation of Antarctica in earnest. The American expedition under Charles Wilkes, 1838 to 1842, the United States Exploring Expedition, the largest scientific expedition America had yet mounted, sailed along the coast of what is now called Wilkes Land in East Antarctica, producing the first significant evidence that the land they were observing was a single large continent rather than a collection of islands. Wilkes's claim was disputed at the time. James Clark Ross, the British naval officer who led the other major expedition of the period, questioned whether Wilkes had actually seen land or ice, but the subsequent history of Antarctic exploration has confirmed the substantial accuracy of Wilkes's observations. James Clark Ross, who had already found the North Magnetic Pole during Arctic explorations and whose voyage south in 1839 to 1843 was the most ambitious Antarctic expedition of the 19th century, made the most spectacular geographical discoveries of the early Antarctic era. Pushing south through the pack ice east of the peninsula in January 1841, Ross found the open water that now bears his name, the Ross Sea, an enormous embayment of the Southern Ocean that penetrated deep into the Antarctic continent and that gave access to latitudes much further south than any previous navigator had reached. He discovered the Ross Ice Shelf, the enormous floating ice platform that forms the southern end of the Ross Sea, larger than France, its ice cliffs rising 30 meters above the sea surface, an apparition so vast and so strange that Ross compared it to the white cliffs of Dover multiplied to an incomprehensible scale. He discovered Mount Erebus, an active volcano rising 3,794 meters above sea level from the Ross Island coast, the most dramatic geological feature in Antarctica and one of the most dramatic on Earth, its summit trailing a permanent plume of volcanic steam against the Antarctic sky. Ross came within 800 kilometers of the South Pole. Nobody came closer for another 60 years. The 6 decades between Ross's expedition and the heroic age of Antarctic exploration that began at the turn of the 20th century were not decades of Antarctic indifference. The continent was visited regularly by sealers and whalers who were following the marine mammal populations southward as northern populations were depleted, and a small number of scientific expeditions added to the geographical knowledge. But they were not decades of the intense focused exploration that the remaining geographical mysteries of the continent deserved. The heroic age, roughly 1895 to 1922, brought the concentrated attention of the most capable explorers of the Edwardian era to the specific challenges that Antarctica posed, producing achievements of extraordinary courage and extraordinary suffering in the pursuit of geographical and scientific knowledge. The first confirmed landing on the Antarctic continent, as opposed to the islands off its coast, was made in 1895 at Cape Adare, during the voyage of the commercial whaling ship Antarctic commanded by Henrik Bull. The first wintering on the continent, the first human beings to spend the Antarctic night on the continent, enduring the months of complete darkness and temperatures that dropped below -40 degrees Celsius, was the Belgian Antarctic expedition of 1897 to 1899, whose ship the Belgica became trapped in the pack ice and wintered involuntarily, the crew surviving partly through the medical intervention of the expedition's doctor, a young American named Frederick Cook. And then came the race for the South Pole, the most famous chapter in Antarctic history, the one that has captured the imagination of every subsequent generation and that produced 2 of the most dramatic stories in the entire literature of exploration. Robert Falcon Scott, the British naval officer whose 2 Antarctic expeditions bracketed the heroic age, made the first deep interior journey in 1902, reaching 82 degrees south with Ernest Shackleton and Edward Wilson in a sledging journey that established the possibility of overland travel in the Antarctic interior and that demonstrated both the extraordinary physical demands and the extraordinary reward, in terms of geographical revelation, of pushing into the continent's heart. Scott's second expedition, the Terra Nova expedition of 1910 to 1913, became the one everyone remembers, for the worst of reasons. He reached the South Pole on January 17, 1912, and found a Norwegian flag already there. Roald Amundsen, the Norwegian explorer who had made the first navigation of the Northwest Passage and who brought to Antarctic exploration the specific advantage of Norwegian skiing and dog-sledging traditions that were far better suited to polar travel than the British combination of man-hauling and ponies that Scott relied on, had reached the South Pole on December 14, 1911, 34 days before Scott. He had turned around and gone home safely. His entire team survived. It was a masterpiece of logistical planning and polar expertise, efficient, ruthless, and completely successful. Scott's team died on the return journey. All 5 of them. Lawrence Oates, whose frostbitten feet were slowing the party down, walked out of the tent into a blizzard with the words, "I am just going outside and maybe some time," and was never seen again, one of the most deliberately self-sacrificing acts in the history of exploration. Scott, Wilson, and Henry Bowers died in their tent 11 miles from a supply depot, pinned down by a blizzard that lasted 9 days, their frozen bodies found 8 months later by a search party with Scott's diary still legible beside him. The diary entries of Scott's final weeks, written in a hand that grew progressively weaker as the cold and the hunger did their work, are among the most powerful documents in the literature of exploration. He wrote of his companions. He wrote of his country. He wrote of the specific unbearable combination of physical suffering and the knowledge that he had been beaten, that he had reached the pole second, that the journey that killed him had not even produced a geographical first. And then he stopped writing. Ernest Shackleton, the Irish-born British explorer whose 3 Antarctic expeditions produced achievements of courage and leadership that have made him the patron saint of every survival course and leadership seminar in the world, wrote the other great chapter of the heroic age. His Nimrod expedition of 1907 to 1909 set a new furthest south record of 88 degrees 23 minutes, within 180 kilometers of the South Pole, close enough to see it with the naked eye on a clear day, before turning back in one of the most agonizing decisions in the history of exploration. He told his wife afterward that he had thought she would prefer a live donkey to a dead lion. He was right. He was alive. He had turned back. And the decision preserved him for the greatest adventure of his life. The Endurance Expedition of 1914 to 1917, Shackletoe's attempt to make the first land crossing of the Antarctic continent, is the story that has defined his legacy and that has made him the most studied leader in the history of polar exploration. The Endurance was caught in the Weddell Sea pack ice in January 1915, drifted for 10 months as the ice slowly crushed the ship, and sank in November 1915, leaving Shackletoe and his 27 men camped on the sea ice with 3 small lifeboats and the most hostile ocean in the world between them and any possible rescue. What followed? The survival on the ice through the Antarctic winter, the open boat journey in the James Caird across 800 miles of the Drake Passage to South Georgia in the most violent ocean on Earth, the crossing of South Georgia's unmapped glaciated mountains in 36 hours with inadequate equipment, the eventual rescue of every single member of the expedition without a single loss of life, is the most extraordinary survival story in the history of exploration. Not one man lost. In the Antarctic. After losing the ship. After camping on drifting sea ice for months. After an 800-mile open boat journey in the worst ocean on Earth. When Shackletoe finally reached the whaling station at Stromness on South Georgia after the mountain crossing, the station manager, who had known Shackletoe before the expedition, looked at the 3 ragged, frostbitten, seal-blubber-blackened men who appeared from the mountains and reportedly said, "Who are you?" Shackletoe told him. The manager turned away and wept. The Antarctic that these explorers found, the continent that had been postulated for 2,000 years and discovered in 1820 and explored at the cost of extraordinary human suffering over the following century, is the most extreme environment on Earth in almost every measurable dimension. It is the coldest, the lowest temperature ever recorded on Earth, -89.2 degrees Celsius, was measured at the Soviet Vostok Station in Antarctica in 1983. It is the highest. The average elevation of the Antarctic continent is approximately 2,300 meters, higher than any other continent, because the ice sheet that covers it is up to 4,800 meters thick. It is the driest. The interior of Antarctica receives less precipitation than the Sahara Desert, technically qualifying as the largest cold desert on Earth. It is the windiest. The katabatic winds that flow off the Antarctic plateau can reach speeds of 300 kilometers per hour. And it is beautiful. In a way that no description and no photograph has ever fully captured, the specific beauty of a landscape of pure ice and pure light, where the absence of biological noise and human construction leaves the fundamental geometry of the Earth exposed in a way that nowhere else on the planet permits. The aurora australis, the southern lights, the Antarctic equivalent of the northern lights, the specific dance of charged particles in the magnetic field producing curtains of green and purple and red light across the winter sky, is among the most extraordinary visual experiences on Earth. The midnight sun of the Antarctic summer, 24 hours of light in which the sun circles the sky without setting, turning the ice into a landscape of gold and pink and the specific blinding white that has no name in any language, produces a quality of light that photographers and painters have been trying to capture for 200 years without exhausting its possibilities. The Antarctic Treaty of 1959, signed by 12 nations and now with 54 signatories, is the most successful international environmental agreement in history. It designated Antarctica as a continent dedicated to peace and science, suspended all territorial claims, prohibited military activity and nuclear testing, and established the framework for international scientific cooperation that has governed the continent ever since. Approximately 70 permanent and summer research stations from 29 countries operate on the Antarctic continent today, conducting research on everything from climate history locked in the ice cores to astrophysics conducted in the atmosphere above the polar plateau to the biology of the extreme life forms that survive in the most hostile environment on Earth. The ice cores are perhaps the most important thing in Antarctica, for the future of the entire human species. The Antarctic ice sheet is a frozen archive of the Earth's climate history, with layers of ice going back 800,000 years. Each layer containing trapped air bubbles that preserve the atmospheric composition of the year in which that snow fell. A record of carbon dioxide and methane and temperature that extends across 8 ice ages and 8 warm periods, and that tells the story of the Earth's climate system in a resolution and a completeness that no other archive can approach. The ice cores tell us what the climate was doing before humans changed it. They tell us what carbon dioxide levels in the atmosphere meant for temperatures in the past. They tell us, with the specific cold authority of 800,000 years of evidence, what the consequences of the atmospheric changes that human industrial activity has produced are likely to be. The continent that was postulated for 2,000 years and discovered by accident by seal hunters is now the most important climate archive on Earth. The landscape that Cook called condemned to everlasting frigidity is now melting, slowly, measurably, consequentially, as the greenhouse gases that human industrial civilization has poured into the atmosphere since the Industrial Revolution warm the planet in ways that the ice cores document with heartbreaking precision. The ice shelf that Ross found in 1841, the one he compared to the White Cliffs of Dover, is retreating. The glacier that Scott and Shackleton crossed are thinning. The sea ice that surrounds the continent and that stopped Cook and trapped the Endurance is declining in extent in ways that the satellite record of the past 40 years documents with unmistakable clarity. The last continent found is now the first to feel what the world is becoming. Terra Australis Incognita. The unknown southern land. It was on the maps for 2,000 years before anyone saw it. It was the most remote and most hostile place on Earth. It was the last thing left to discover. And everything it is now telling us, from its ice cores and its melting shelves and its rising temperatures, is the most important thing the Earth has left to say. We should listen.